Hello, I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild audio podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it.
This week, as we mark the 10th anniversary of the National Bison Legacy Act, WCS Wild Audio revisits its report on how extraordinary partnerships across geography, culture, and politics help make the American bison our national mammal. Looking ahead to the 250th anniversary of American independence this July, there can be no better time to reflect on the bison, as both a symbol of our shared past and a reminder of our responsibility to protect the wildlife, landscapes, and cultural legacies that define us. Nat Moss has the story.
In some ways, the national mammal effort began over a century ago with the Bronx Zoo's founding director, William Hornaday.
William Hornaday presumed they were going to go extinct. His first venture was to go out and collect specimens for taxonomic preservation, so that would be what we had, was those mounted specimens. But he had an epiphany and realized they could do more.
That's Keith Aune, former head of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Bison Program. WCS Executive Vice President for Public Affairs John Calvelli credits Keith for the inspiration to designate the bison as the U.S. national mammal.
Keith Aune had a long and illustrious career in the public sector and then came and worked for us and coordinated our bison work. And he had done this research showing that William Hornaday had actually asked that the national mammal be the bison.
Bison, which once roamed the western plains of the United States in the tens of millions, had been reduced to near extinction by the turn of the 20th century by uncontrolled hunting. Keith Aune says that was the context in which Hornaday floated the national mammal idea.
William Hornaday, in his appeal for the bison when they were first trying in 1905 to get people to consider conservation and restoration of this species, specifically mentions in a paragraph of his appeal that this is an animal that has national interest and focus and should be considered our national animal.
It was in 1905 that Hornaday, with the support of President Theodore Roosevelt, had established the American Bison Society, or ABS, which helped organize the repopulation of bison in the western plains that helped save North America's largest mammal from extinction. By the 1930s, says Aune, the patriarchs of the ABS thought their work was done.
And many of us said, well, no, there's lots of work yet to do. And after about a 40-year pause, we've come back to this animal and said, let's begin this work again.
For many tribal nations in the United States, that process began in 1992 with the creation of the Intertribal Buffalo Council, or ITBC. Jim Stone, who would later become ITBC Executive Director, recalls how a handful of tribes from South Dakota down to New Mexico were interested in buffalo restoration on tribal lands and established an organization to build on that idea.
There's always been that native desire to have buffalo back on their lands and something that was missing. And so I think as you go through the 60s and the tribal power movement and you look at all the changes in government to government relationship and things that happened, it made it easier for tribes to access buffalo and bring them back to the land.
Still, says Jim, it was never a given that this would happen.
I don't know if there was ever a consideration that buffalo would come back, and I think when these things start happening, then with us, it's kind of like that rebirth. And so you have to kind of study and remember what that relationship was, for instance, when we harvested an animal, going back and looking at what were the songs, what were the ceremonies, how did we go about doing the hunt 100 years ago? So a lot of those things had kind of fallen by the wayside. You don't really have time to consider how things are going to come back. But once that situation arises and buffalo are back on our landscape, how are you reincorporating that traditional historic relationship that exists in our world since time immemorial?
In 2005, Dave Carter was working with the NBA. No, not the Pro Basketball League, the National Bison Association, the leading group of bison producers, processors, and marketers. At the time, there were divisions between the three main bison constituencies, the Native American tribal community, the bison ranching community, and the conservation community. There were different conceptions about the importance of bison as a sustainable food source, as a cultural icon, and as a critical representative of North American biodiversity. Dave says he and then NBA head Mike Duncan invited WCS staff out to Colorado to discuss the situation.
John Calvelli and Eva Fern and Kent Redford all came out and we sat down, and that day really marked the start of some collaborative efforts of, okay, let's see how we can work together. Mike Duncan, who was the guy that kind of helped pull together that first meeting, he says we all have different approaches to how we manage and steward this animal. But at the heart of it is this magnificent animal that we all love. And I think that's the magic right there, the bison that brought us all together.
Those conversations would lead to the reconstitution of the American Bison Society exactly 1 century after its original founding, and it marked the growing conversation between tribal nations, bison meat producers, and conservationists. By 2011, Dave had become the new head of the National Bison Association, and Jim Stone then led the Intertribal Buffalo Council. Dave remembers a conversation with Keith in Montana at the end of an ABS conference in Big Sky.
Keith Aune from WCS and I were sitting out on the patio having a beer. And Keith said, you know, Dave, I've been talking to Jim Stone at the Intertribal Buffalo Council that the U.S. doesn't have a national mammal. And I think maybe we ought to make bison the national mammal of the U.S. He said, Jim thinks it's a great idea. What do you think? And I was like, wow, that is an incredible idea.
Keith Aune picks up the story.
When I stumbled across these quotations from Hornaday that bison should be our national animal, we started bantering that around. Actually, I called NBA. Dave Carter was a good friend. And I talked to ITBC, Jim Stone, whom I interacted with a great deal anyway at this point. And we started thinking about this, and we actually wrote up a case for bison as our national mammal in June of 2011. And we presented this to John Calvelli, who is a great friend and colleague, and I respect him greatly. He picked it up right away and figured this is something we can do.
Keith came to us and said, this might be something that could help unite the business community, the civic community, the political community, that we could come together behind this simple concept of celebrating this animal that really helped shape America's history. So for all of us within WCS, we saw this as a great clarion call. But what we were able to do was bring the 3 groups together, the Intertribal Buffalo Council, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the National Bison Association. And we started to map out a strategy on how we were going to work to designate the bison the national mammal.
Just as Jim Stone, Dave Carter, and Keith Aune had to see through their different perspectives on the important role of bison in the American narrative, so too did John Calvelli work to thread the needle required to bring together congressional leaders with different political cultures, priorities, and perspectives necessary to push a bill through the U.S. Congress and be signed by the president. It began with the Bronx's liberal representative, Jose Serrano.
The obvious first person to go to was Congressman Jose Serrano. Congressman Serrano represents the South Bronx. Congressman Serrano, during his tenure in Washington, D.C., was one of the Wildlife Conservation Society's best friends. This was an individual who understood that the Bronx Zoo was this amazing cultural institution in New York City, but he also understood that the Bronx Zoo was the headquarters of this global organization that was helping to save biodiversity and protect wildlife. So we went to Congressman Serrano very early on and said, would this be something that you would do? And he said, I always love supporting initiatives that promote the greatness of the Bronx. So of course he quickly signed on.
Out west, John and his team approached leaders who lived among bison and appreciated their contribution to the landscape, culture, and livelihoods of their constituents. There was Democratic Senator Tim Johnson of South Dakota and Republican Senator Mike Enzi of Wyoming, the original 2 Senate sponsors. Soon, Republican Senator John Hoeven of North Dakota would sign on, and Martin Heinrich, the Democratic Senator of New Mexico. There was then Representative Kristi Noem of South Dakota, who was herself a bison rancher. And then there was Lacey Clay from Missouri, whose connection to the bison sprung not from the geography of his home or even his commitment to conservation. Again, here's John Calvelli.
Early on, we went to Lacey Clay, and it was one of the more fascinating conversations because we were just asking for his support. And he said, no, I want to push this. I want to be one of the original sponsors of the legislation. And I said, Congressman, why do you care about this so deeply? You represent St. Louis, Missouri. And he said, my great uncle was a Buffalo soldier, and the buffalo has an important place in our family history. So by celebrating the bison, we're also recognizing the history and the legacy of my family and of my people. And I still get chills when I think about that conversation because it was coming from the heart. It was this individual saying, I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do, and these are the types of initiatives that help bring our country together.
To help impress upon this diverse group of congressional leadership a sense of public enthusiasm for the idea of the bison as the U.S. national mammal, John's team at WCS assembled a constituency drawn from, in addition to the NBA and the ITBC, the broader conservation community, including, especially, the passionate membership of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. It was 2012, an election year. They called it Vote Bison. Keith Aune elaborates.
We needed to expose Americans to the American bison once again. And so we were having phone calls amongst all of the partners. And eventually we would recruit a lot of other folks, NGOs, businesses, schools, academic institutions, into this idea of making bison our national mammal.
Dave Carter describes the power of these collective voices when they gathered in the Capitol building to pursue this specific goal.
All of a sudden, here was Sean Calvelli and Keith Aune from WCS and Jim Stone from the Intertribal Buffalo Council and Dave Carter from the National Bison Association, all in the office together, saying, here's something that's important to all three of us. And that was really powerful. And I think it elevated overall the stature of the bison in Washington, D.C.
After a complication related to commemorative legislation was resolved, Jim Stone remembers the day he heard that the vote on the bill would be coming.
It seemed like they were moving things through. Whatever little obstacles were there were removed, and the day was getting set and the mammal designation was being made. So that was a pretty amazing moment.
On May 9th, 2016, President Barack Obama signed the National Bison Legacy Act into law, making the American bison the U.S. national mammal. Dave Carter says his only regret was that there wasn't time to get a live bison onto the south lawn of the White House. He and Jim Stone and Keith Aune all say that the national mammal designation is just the first step in bringing the bison back to a place of prominence it was held in our nation, ecologically, culturally, and as a healthy and sustainable food source. Here's Keith Aune.
We're never going to go back to 60 million bison on the vast parts of the American West. But there are places left of substantial size, millions of acres or more, where we can have 1,000 bison and they can play their ecological role out much as they did 1,000 years ago and stay on that evolutionary pathway for millennia. Temperate grasslands are the least protected biome in the world, and they fast disappeared on us at the time of the great plowouts. But there are these places left, and I'm excited that there are people thinking about that and thinking about that larger scale.
For John Calvelli, the success of the Vote Bison campaign demonstrates what can happen when an organized citizenry make their voices heard. And whether you're a regular Wild Audio listener or new to our podcast, that means you.
The importance of our listeners and the role that they can play to help frame what the issues are is incredibly important. I think sometimes people feel a sense of cynicism. Oh, what's that letter going to do? Or why should I bother making that phone call? please do not be cynical. I worked on Capitol Hill, and I was the one getting those emails and getting those phone calls. And guess what? When they're hearing on an issue with that frequency and from that broad base of support, where you've got the business community, you've got the indigenous community, and you've got a conservation organization all coming together, that's powerful. That actually can move things.
Jim Stone completes the thought.
That was the idea, that it meant something to so many different people. In newspaper articles that talk about it, it's always one of the items that they include, the national mammal. So every generation going forward, when they see buffalo or bison, they're going to see national mammal attached to it in some form. And so just that idea that it was elevated to a position it deserved, to me, that's kind of what the effort was for. Now it's on everybody to just keep progressing and moving forward.
For WCS Wild Audio, this is Nat Moss.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Nat Moss, with help from Hannah Kaplan and Dan Rosen. The WCS Wild Audio podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Please join us next week for a new episode. And don't forget to rate or review the show wherever you get your podcast.